And so we move on to the Industrial Revolution, really the second Industrial Revolution. We looked last time at the Industrial Revolution beginning in England. That was an agricultural revolution that eventually led to the surplus resources being created into textiles and into manufactured goods at a mass basis, and that leads to the industrialization spreading to Europe from the United Kingdom as workers from the United Kingdom, as inventors from the United Kingdom, as information and technology from the United Kingdom leaks out towards um, the continent. You see Belgium, France, and some of the German states being the first uh, to um, to industrialize, and the this industrial capacity is felt honestly the most in the United States. The United States, with its vast quantities of natural resources, takes the ideas from England, from continental Europe, and really puts it into motion. And the United States is really transformed by industrialization and by transportation of industrialization. So it allows for the movement of goods, and it allows for the movement of people from the east all the way to the west in the United States, and it really changes the United States as a whole. However, other countries really don't benefit in industrialization as much as others, as some industrial countries or some countries don't industrialize because European forces are conspiring against them. You see a lot of these European states, like the United Kingdom, France, and the German states, pursuing these policies of keeping uh, the growth of industry away from Central and Eastern um, European nations. So Russia, the Baltic states, even the Iberian Peninsula, and the Mediterranean don't really, as you can see here, they don't really industrialize as quickly. France and the German states uh, basically block off industrialization for all of these other nations, and so you have a limited industrialization in some of those areas, and really leads to a lot of inequality throughout the continent. Um, you do begin to see with the industrial revolution a new um, population boom that happens as industry begins to move into the cities. You have this big population boom for for the continent. You see the doubling between 1750 and 1850. So between that first industrial revolution, the beginnings of the second industrial revolution in the 1820s, you're going to see this huge uh, movement of people and this huge influx of new citizens into cities, and this population boom. The original baby boomers here in 1750 to 1850. Now, as I said at the beginning, we're going to be looking more at how industrialization affects society and affects culture, much more than the political ramifications. We're going to be looking at how industrialization affects people, how industrialization is reacted to by culture and by society, and really how these changes in national identities is created, and how this leads up to the creation of nationalism. So, as I was saying, you have this huge upswing in population growth and this huge upswing in urbanization. As I said, the the population doubles between 1750 and 1850 in Europe, and then by 1850, looking just at England, the over 50% of the British lived in towns and cities, so they quickly moved into the towns and cities. Now, this is pretty notable, if you consider the fact that people have been that the actual England as we sort of know it has been uh, uh, has been in effect since 1066. So it took over about 800 years for England to really urbanize. Whereas if you look at the United States, founded in 1776, even if you want to go back to 16 to 1600 with the first permanent settlement, by 1920 you have this over 50% of people living in towns and cities. So in the United States, it takes less than 200 years versus 800 years in England. So once a country really begins to industrialize, then you see people moving into the urban areas where the jobs are and where the rest of the people are. And once this happens, you start seeing the creation of an industrial middle class. Okay, you start seeing a new business aristocracy created by entrepreneurs, basically the nouveau riche, or the new rich people. These were people that gained social respectability, but they sought more power, more especially more political power. As some of these people began their lives poor, or in firmly in the lower class. They would move up in society and become this new type of aristocracy, and as they gain more money, they gain more social respectability, as they were seen as wealthy and as betters, but they wanted to have more power. It's one thing to have wealth, but to have actual power, actual political power, was a lot more was a lot more um, was a lot more desirable to people. So they begin to create a new aristocracy, a new elite, out of people that clawed their way from the lower classes up into uh, this new money. And this is why I feel that there is still this ideal in the United States, as tough as it is, that there is and even not just in the United States, but in a lot of Western societies, that you can work your way up with just hard work and determination, that you can basically make yourself go from nothing to the richest people in the world with just your own two hands. There is this time during the Industrial Revolution when people actually did this. Now it's much harder to do so now, because if you want to create this new telecom company, you have to basically fight against the giants out there. But during the Industrial Revolution, everyone basically had a shot. At least if you were a white male landowner, you definitely had a shot. But it really feeds into this cultural idea of what it means to be um, successful. What it means to have power is not just to have wealth, but also to be able to use that wealth. um, However, at this time that you're creating this middle class, you also have this new industrial proletariat being created. This industrial lower class that is um, constantly being put upon by this, not only the old aristocracy, the old money, but also by this new aristocracy that are trying to gain more wealth, gain more power, and are using the poor to do so, are exploiting a lot of the underclass, a lot of the people that might have been them at one point, and this is how the elite are able to basically put up more and more roadblocks as they see how they came up and how they persevered. They begin to be they begin to put up roadblocks for the proletariat, for the people down at the bottom, so that there is this cycle of poverty that begins with industrialization. And this inequality of industrialization is really evident when you start to look at what exactly is happening, how industrial prosperity is growing throughout the world. You're starting to see the emergence of a world economy. You're starting to see goods and services moving, excuse me, goods and people moving throughout nations much more quickly as you start seeing a transportation revolution with marine with steamships and railroads and things like that. You start seeing foreign markets for Western goods. European capital begins to be invested, and industrialization spreads from Europe slowly, but it does spread from Europe to other parts of the world. So there is a lot of industrial prosperity that it's is spreading throughout the globe, but a lot of that is being kept at the top by the aristocracy, by the wealthy elite, and it doesn't really uh trickle down, for lack of a better term, to the industrial working class. Okay, working conditions were often wretched for the working class at this time, especially um, in areas that weren't as urbanized and as industrialized. Trying to get these actual raw materials, both in England and in the continental Europe and the United States. You had people working in coal mines. People still work in those pretty harsh conditions, but back then even the conditions were even worse as safety and health and the prosperity of the worker was second nat- was came in second um to the making of money. um you had a lot of child labor that was exploited more than ever. The original industrial revolution, the agricultural revolution, you would have women that would be working in these factories, but women often a wanted more money, b would get married to go have families, or get pregnant or things like that. And so instead of using women that might not be there or might want or expect more money, factories began to use child labor. Children had small hands, small feet that wouldn't be um, as easily cotton machines, but they still would be cotton machines, and you would have children mangled from childhood into adulthood. But the industrial machine needs to be kept moving, and so children began to become part of this just other cogs in this industrial machine. Women, however, did begin to dominate the labor force in many areas, especially in the western portions of the United States, where there weren't as many men, or where men didn't really want to be doing the work. And women really dominated a lot of the labor forces, especially when it came to garments, to uh, to using cloth, weaving cloth, creating dresses, things like that. A lot of things that had to do with garments. Women were the primary labor force, and they dominated the labor force, but they still were paid much less than any of their male counterparts, because they were just doing women's work. It wasn't like they were doing real work. It was just the work of women, so it wasn't as important. And so the question then becomes, is, did industrialization bring an improved standard of living? Okay, you have more money flowing into countries, so people can buy more, people can spend more. The middle class were the real gainers. So more money's flowing in. There is a new middle class. They are gaining a lot of money and power that the industrial workers had to wait to benefit. So this is not a easy question to answer, because does it bring an improved standard of living? For some people it definitely does, but for others it actually makes things a lot worse. So industrialization a um has a pretty heavy cost put on the workers themselves. Um this human cost of industry is paid greatly by the underclass. You have a lot of dangerous urbanization where you have these pollution woes that leads to health deterioration. So even though you might have more money, you might have more people living in cities, booming cities. If they are all covered under soot, then then what's it worth if the people have chronic lung diseases and don't live very long because of tainted water, tainted food, and tainted air? Factory work is very deadly. We'll discuss the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York a lot more in depth in class. But basically, women and children were often sacrificed to the machine of industrialization. They were very easily exploited, and laws in industrial nations were not meant to protect the people, were not meant to protect the workers. They were there to make sure that businesses would run efficiently, and the people were sort of an afterthought to business. Another part of the human cost are the packed cities where you have lots of slums, where most workers would live in. You also had a lot of ethnic enclaves that kept society segregated. You will see this going even into the 20th century, in some places even into the 21st century, where cities are very heavily segregated, even among the workers, even among the people that are the most exploited. They still would either self-segregate or be segregated by law, and would lead to a society where the underclass were continually uh, at each other's throats or not trusting one another. You would have you had great class conflict, as status was no longer based on race, religion, etc. Status was based on money. It didn't matter what your last name was if you didn't have a dime to it. It's all about money. It's all about capital. It's all about who what you have, not who you are. And so the wealthy elite and the large, you had this wealthy elite up at the top, and then at the bottom you have this uh, large working class, and that began to be pushed back upon by the working class. And finally, you had the issue of women in cities, where women would move away from the countryside to go make some money, to go try and find themselves uh, a better life, because basically this was the role of women outside of the cities. They were used just as much for labor as men were, and it was often literal backbreaking work. And so it's better to move into a city to work in a factory, even with the dangers there, than to basically be a mule for a cart. And this leads to the rise of what is known as the women's sphere. It becomes much more acceptable for women to become teachers, to become caretakers, because that is the role of women, is to take care of the family and to take care of the home. And so it is their place to do so. And then basically, as soon as they make some money, that they're there to find a husband for support. A lot of places, even here in Arizona, uh, teachers couldn't be married because they're supposed to go off and have kids. They're supposed to start a family and move away. So most of the teachers that you would find that would be graduating from things like the normal school or what is now ASU would be single women, and as soon as they were married, they could no longer be teachers because, they were past their point, they're past the expiration date, and they should be getting married instead. So basically, there's little opportunities for single women. There's more opportunities for single women in factories than there is in the mines, but really, it is the ideal is to start a family. Be young, move into the city, work somewhere, make some money, find a man, and then go and basically have him take care of you while you take care of his children. So all of these things, the urbanization, the slums, the beginning of class conflict, the issue of women in cities is the human cost for industrialization. And as this human cost grows, there begins to be more of a need to to reform society, to reform industry in order to make it much more fair, or if not much more fair, than less onerous on the individual. So you have a lot of problems with industrialization. Obviously, you have the rough working conditions, and you also have long hours, little pay, and the way that industrial work schedules basically beat you down and grind workers down to the bone. You have a lot of people that are looking for a job, so they can't really complain too much because you will basically be replaced by someone who won't be as wanting for the basic amenities of life in order to work. So there's really no guarantee of a job, especially if you want to speak out. There's also a lot of exploitation, especially of children and of women. And so, with the continuing problems with industrialization, you start seeing people, clergymen. You start seeing a lot of the old rich money. You start seeing a lot of religious organizations and union organizations rise up and begin to put pressure on governments to change things, and eventually government does step in with things like the Great Reform Act of 1832 in Britain, that really puts that really brings in this more this more of a um, leash on unbridled industrialization, unbridled capitalism, um, uh, unbridled exploitation of the workers. You start seeing more government in oversight of industry, and pretty soon you have things like the 8-hour workday, weekends, and things like that will come through within the between 1850 and the early 1900s. You also have the rise of labor unions, things like the Industrial Workers of the World, that are there to give negotiating power to the workers. But what happens is that they become a voting bloc. Labor unions do, and so they also are easily exploited as politicians begin to see the power of labor unions, and labor unions begin to see themselves as power brokers to politicians as well. And so once politics and the economics really into begin to get into bed together, then it becomes a combustible element. And so labor unions are in the 20th century are cut back and uh, uh, are really neutered to a point of not really being able to do anything here in this 20th century. But during the 1800s, labor unions were the only negotiating power that workers really had against the big industry. You do see conservative elements fighting back, however, led by Germany's Otto von Bismarck. You have these conservative elements that are going to begin to do things like get rid of labor unions, or to get rid of any sort of leftist ideals. You have in Russia the czar and a lot of conservative leaders are going to do things like outlaw far left elements, and so far left ideals are basically outlawed in Russia, and things like labor union and collective bargaining are outlawed in the German Confederation. And what are these elements, you might ask? Well, let's go and look at some of these new modern ways of thinking. So, it is during the Industrial Revolution that you also see the modernization of thought, the bringing of new ideas to the world that build upon, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, and things like that. And one of the things that you see is the emergence of modern science. And the emergence of modern science, we're going to go ahead and just focus on one of these ideals, and that is the writings of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin wrote on the origin of species in 1859, where he creates or posits at least, the theory of evolution. And there have been other theories of evolution, of how things change, of how human beings have come to be the way that they are, how animals have come to be the way that they are. And a lot of these works really have no they show that things do change over time, but they don't say why. And this is where Charles Darwin comes in, because his theory of evolution is that the best adaptations will be the most successful. So the best adaptations are the ones that allow animals to live longer, to reproduce more, to survive and adapt. And so it is these adaptations for the animal that makes them much more viable. And so these new adaptations will genetically be passed on to the next generation, and so on and so on and so on, until you get to the modern world. And this is a very long, very slow process that happens over thousands and thousands of years. One thing that the theory of evolution is not, it is not the strongest who survive. It is not the strongest who always are on top. If so, the dinosaurs would have lived for much, much longer time, and they would be still dominant. So it doesn't matter if you are the strongest. Uh, it just matters that it is the best adaptation, that you have the best adaptation. That is how you will be successful, and that is how you will pass on your genes, and pass on these adaptive traits to further generations. But what happens is that Charles Darwin's um, ideas are warped by thinking, by the pseudoscientists. And a lot of thinkers began to say, well, if Darwin Darwin shows that it is the best species that adapt and move forward, shouldn't that be the same with societies? And so the idea of social Darwinism begins to emerge, especially with the writings of Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer actually coins the term survival of the fittest. Basically, that the strongest, that the best animals will be the ones that survive. This goes against Darwin's original ideas, because Darwin's saying it's not always the strongest, not always the fittest. It is those that can adapt to change and are much quicker and much more malleable. But instead, social Darwinists move Darwin's ideas to societies and say that the best cultures always end up on top. The strongest cultures always end up in charge, and this begins to lead to a lot of the justification for things like slavery, justification for things like colonialism, for genocide, and for European white supremacy. It's basically that it is the strongest cultures that end up in charge, and this leads to a lot of racist ideals being generally accepted by high society. And so Herbert Spencer is he's a philosopher, and and a writer that gets nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his work, or the Nobel Prize, not peace, the Nobel Prize for his work, and it is uh, a pretty dominant idea that the most um, fit in the world are European cultures, and they are the ones that are in charge. They are in charge because they are the best societies. Why are they in charge? Because of the best societies. Why are they the best societies? Because they're in charge. So the sort of circular reasoning leads to these cultures being or this idea that Western society is much more socially fit than other societies. So not only does philosophy and science change during the Industrial Revolution, but you also see the emergence of a modern culture. You start seeing people react to industrialization and create new forms of artistic expression. Literature really either embraces industrialization or reacts against it. This reaction against industrialization in literature is known as romanticism, and romanticism is basically rebelling against the rigidness of industrialization and the rigidness of this new world, of this industrial world that is very urban, very uniform, and really has a lot of rules in society. And so romantics are rebelling against this rigid life in society. They're escaping reality, trying to escape the modern life and looking at the pastoral, looking at nature, looking at the the general um, the general world outside of the city. Creating people like Shelley, Lord Byron, William Blake create literary works and poetry that celebrate simple life, that celebrate the wilderness, that celebrate um, uh, this ideal culture outside of the urban existence. And this gives to the rise of sort of a fetishizing of the rural landscapes of a simple life, kind of giving it this more utopian feel than it really did have. And then there's the opposite of this, which is realism, which is basically taking a long, hard look at human existence, at examining the nature of existence in this modern world, not escaping from reality, but instead shining a light on the injustices of the world. People like Charles Dickens were looking at the way that society treated the worst among us. People like Mark Twain showed the the relationship that it was based on race. People like Tolstoy and Victor Hugo are going to write about the state of man, and what society and laws do to humanity. So realism is really this sort of, you're not going to escape. This is not for escapism. This is to kind of look at society and say, we can do better than this, and we this is the shortcomings of human beings. um, you also have romantic art. Romanticism in art is all about, just like romanticism in literature is all about embracing nature, looking at the ideal life. And then you also have Impressionism, which is a rebelling against the rigid classical art. It's more about using the palette to sort of imply movement, um, imply the the picture that is being put there. So it's not. impressionism and romanticism aren't as opposed as romanticism and realism are in literature, but they're sort of different ways of looking at society, either going out looking at the beauty of nature, or trying to sort of go against the rigidity of what art is supposed to be. And then finally we'll get to this new philosophy. We're going to get to it eventually. Now it's time to really start look at socialism. Yes, people, it is time to talk about socialism. I don't know why my PowerPoint is doing this to the Communist Manifesto, but basically we're going to be looking at the works of Karl Marx, especially when it comes to the Communist Manifesto. And in the Communist Manifesto, you have Marx and Engels laying out their theory of socialism. And basically, the theory of socialism is, we'll go much more in depth in this in class, is that the means of production is power. Those that control the means of production have the power. The workers are going to be oppressed by the owners of the means of production. So, the means of production is it are the factories, are the agricultural centers, are the farms. So everywhere that things are being produced, the people that are producing things, they should have the power, except the workers are actually oppressed because the owners of the means of production are trying to maximize profit and reduce labor costs, while the working class is trying to maximize their wages and improve their working conditions. So you have this class conflict between them, and so this class conflict would lead to revolution. And this revolution of all these workers rising up would lead to a classless society. It would lead to the people controlling the means of production, and there no longer being a classless society. And so we'll get more into this in class. But this is just basically the underlying philosophy, the underlying theory of socialism is that those that can rise up and take control of production of goods or production of whatever makes capital, if the workers can take control of it, they could eventually create a classless society where everyone lives equally. And so this theory of socialism is going to lead to the rise of socialist parties, especially in Germany, where you have the German Social Democratic Party, or the SPD, emerging in 1875. And the SPD worked to improve the condition of workers. The SPD was a much more moderate socialist party, still is. The German Social Democratic Party basically tries to deny revolutionary socialism. They feel that you can work within a society to create a much more equal, much more just society where the workers can control parts of the means of production, but there is no rising up. There is no revolutionary socialism, and this is sort of the crux of the break between hardcore extremist socialists and um, the much more moderate, I guess, legitimate, for lack of a better term, socialist Democrats. Is this idea of a revolution, of a rising up, of a forceful takeover by the workers? The German social the German um, democratic socialists are going to be much more moderate, and so they are going to eventually be pushed off to the side by the more radical socialist revolutionaries, but in the end, socialist democracies in Europe will be much longer lived than the revolutionary socialists. Um, and so, like I said, we'll get more into this in class, but this is where we'll go ahead and leave off this section, and next we'll move into nationalism as a whole.